That's Gin Mill Blues. Joe Sullivan wrote Gin Mill Blues, and he was a piano player from Chicago, and I think there may be something to what some people call Chicago style on piano. All I know is that many years ago I was playing at a jazz party, not an informal one, but like an official jazz party, which is kind of a jazz festival with fancier interests. There were two bands, and I was fooling around at the piano in the first band before the music was going to start. And while I was fooling around, the bass player in the other band, and this is actually exactly how it happened, he came running up to me and he was laughing, which I always thought was one of the two great responses to art, laughing or crying. And he said, "Man, you're playing Chicago style." And that bass player was Milt Hinton, who's one of the legendary bass players in jazz history. And I suppose I said, "Thank you." And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess so." But I wasn't exactly sure what that meant, and I think that merits a little search right here through the forces in my life that led me to play the way I do that might be Chicago style, or it's just Chicago piano players. But that was what happened that day, and I think there are some things that can pin down Chicago style. Actually, I should say something else about how I first played piano. I came from Chicago, but I never played any piano or knew anything about jazz. I'm Norwegian, and I played accordion. And when I moved to Seattle with my family when I was in high school, I still didn't know anything until I bumped into a radio show in Tacoma. It was KTAC, and it was a guy named Terry McMonigal. Every Saturday he played jazz records, and I was completely fascinated. And I'd get my typewriter out, and I'd type out all the names of the musicians and the songs every Saturday, and I'd try to learn who they were. And sometimes he went to San Francisco and got records of people who were playing now. And that was a real turning point, because I wanted to hear live people playing things. And the live person I heard on his show was Burt Bales, who was playing at Pier 23 in San Francisco, where I sometimes play now. And I headed down there to see Burt Bales when I was 18. And we became friends from that time on. But Burt Bales was known for ragtime and Jelly Roll Morton, and he did that just wonderfully, and I did that too. But the biggest thing about Burt Bales was simply the way his hands touched the keys. And maybe like a duck imprinting, I thought that was how you always did it. And I was pretty lucky that Burt Bales was my introduction to that. So if he played a little ragtime, it might sound like this. This is a little bit of Temptation Rag, the way Burt played it. It was all really beautiful. There were these shadings of tones and volume and soft and blue-like sounds, and I just loved that. And he could shift then into like playing any kind of pop tune, because he took any song that was good, and I know one he recorded was Darkness on the Delta. there seemed to be no difference in the way he played ragtime and just an ordinary song. It was all in the touch. And that really stayed with me. And the next piano player who affected my life was the next year in Seattle. Another great West Coast piano player, Johnny Whitwer, was just beginning to teach piano, and I became one of his first two students along with Bob Gilman, another piano player I knew. And there are only a couple things I want to mention about it. You know, I was like starting from nowhere as sort of a beginning piano player, and I wanted to play jazz right away, and we kind of worked out how to do that. And the first thing he wrote in my notebook was "make 'em dance," which meant my wrists, that your wrists had to be loose. And that was to play octaves, whatever I did. And that was really important, although I didn't know it at the time. Loose wrists, you don't play with stiff arms. And the other thing was that as I learned things, he wanted me to play duets with him, so that every time you learned something, you would try it out and, you know, actually accomplish things. I'd learn intervals to play just right and how to kind of have a working class attitude toward playing with another person. So that was kind of how I got into this. But then Chicago style, the first thing about Chicago style, or any style, is all music is a narrative of some kind. It starts somewhere and it goes somewhere. And with the Chicago piano players that I listened to, there always seemed to be this sort of toughened attitude about living life their way and playing their way. And there wasn't any template that you could drape on a Chicago piano player, whether it was Earl Hines or Joe Sullivan, Jess Stacy, Art Hodes, Cass Simpson, Zinke Cohn, all the guys that I learned very quickly that I was just crazy about, because they were always taking chances when they played, like inventing the whole world whenever they sat down at the piano. And there were certain particular technical things that people mentioned. Earl Hines said it's all octaves in the right hand, tenths in the left hand. Joe Sullivan said it was playing with two hands. So as far as Hines goes, he was sort of the father of all piano playing. And he played octaves, he said, because he needed to be heard over the band, but it soon became a way of playing. Fast octaves. One thing he did when he played octaves in the right hand was to play a little grace note sometimes. So if you go from C up to C as an octave, he'd then put the B, the next step down. And whatever octave he hit would have that one note giving a little brightness to it. All this led people to say he played trumpet-style piano. He also played a little trombone-style piano, I know, because when he started accompanying people, he played a lot of rolling tremolos in the left hand and became sort of a trombone piano player. So if, say, Jimmy Noon's orchestra was playing Sweet Lorraine, and in the middle of it, it goes like this. Hines at the same time would do this. And he'd simulate almost like a trombone part, these low things. I do that sometimes, and every now and then I get a nod of recognition from somebody who's heard a Jimmy Noon record and heard Earl Hines do that. Joe Sullivan had his particular way of playing octaves, and in doing so, he had a little smash in his right palm at the same time. which I did in Gin Mill Blues. And sometimes people think that's maybe crude, but it was percussive and it fit. It almost seemed to have chordal sounds. Charles Ives did it, Henry Cowell did it, and they called it tone clusters. And I suppose you could say Joe Sullivan played a tone cluster. And Jelly Roll Morton did this to play Tiger Rag, so it all fits. Jess Stacy played his octaves like this. It was like a trailing vibrato, not quite as dominating as Hines' octaves, but so that was his way. Art Hodes, who played mostly blues, played his octaves quite a bit like Earl Hines with the little grace note. So there were a lot of different ways that there were variations in the octaves. And the tenths were the key to everything. Playing a tenth in the left hand, immediately it gives a fat sound, a harmonic sound, and a rhythmic sound. It's an octave, and you go up an extra third above it. Now, some people don't have big hands, and I'm one of them, and I can't reach all of them. And I think many piano players figured out other ways to play octaves, or play tenths, and in addition to just reaching them, there were a lot of other ways that were they weren't just ways to get there, but they also made good sounds. So in addition to playing, you might roll the octave. It took up the same amount of time as a straight tenth. Sometimes, I call it a rocking tenth. Joe Sullivan did this. And it takes 2 beats, so it simulates the rhythm that you would get by doing this. And it gives kind of a lighter, for me, a lighter and fatter sound for playing up-tempo things. Joe Sullivan was able to get extra harmonies in there. I can't quite reach those accurately, but I get kind of the same idea, I think. And you could also play the top half of a tenth, which would be a tenth with the bass left out. Which sounded a little bit thin on slow tempos, but pretty good on a fast tempo. It would give it an almost guitar-like sound. And both Burt Bales and Earl Hines did this thing of bringing their other hand in. I saw Burt Bales do this. Nice effect to use two hands. And then the ultimate example was to simply use two hands, the bass note and the 10th, using two hands. You could also have an octave in the left hand, or an octave in the right hand and left hand. Which made a nice sound for accompanying people. But it was hard to play a solo and use your two hands in the bass part. So what I do is shoot my hand back and forth, kind of give the illusion that I'm playing tenths real fast by using two hands, and then go up here and then back and forth. So that using two hands to make tenths was kind of neat and also very effective, I think, for accompanying other people. And so those are some things about octaves and tenths. Another way to know what something is to know what it isn't. And people generally tend to use the word stride in talking about early piano styles. And I guess it's all true. Stride does refer to the left-hand pattern of bass and chord. But I think everyone plays stride somewhat. My mother played stride. Thelonious Monk played stride. If you were standing over the piano and had died of a heart attack, as you fell, you'd probably play stride for just a second or two as your hands hit the keys, because the piano was made for your left and right hand to be in those places. The real question about this is if Chicago piano players play stride, that's not really like this kind of stride I think of. I think of that as like the Harlem music and Fats Waller and James P. Johnson, which is a great music, but it's not the same. And the difference is not in the left hand, but in the right hand, where the Harlem players, I think of them as pianistic, using the pattern of black and white keys and the correct fingering and playing complicated figures in the right hand, whereas piano players in Chicago tended to just play octaves and funny things and use the piano as a vehicle for sound. It was a sound vehicle rather than a piano. And consistent with that, there are like songs, way more compositions in Harlem Stride, like handful of keys. Fats Waller, James P. Johnson played that, other people play it now, and it's really great. But if you hear someone play a handful of keys and you know how it goes, when it starts to be played, you can pretty much guess what you're going to hear for the rest of the song. If that piano player plays it again, it's kind of going to sound like that the next time. And if someone else plays a handful of keys, it's going to sound like that when they play it. Maybe faster, slower, more accurate, and so on. And I talked about that with Jess Stacy one time. And I said, well, how do you feel about that? What about handful of keys? And he raised his hands and said, handful of keys, what would I do with it? What would I do? Because there wasn't anything left to do. And so maybe the Chicago point of view is you have to do something with a song. You have to make it into the song from the ground up. Jess also said, it's a crapshoot when I play. I don't know what I'm going to do, which wouldn't be the way to approach handful of keys. Okay. I'm going to talk a little about Joe Sullivan. Joe Sullivan was a Chicago pianist who was in the 1920s on all the great original Chicago recordings. His first influences were Earl Hines and Fats Waller, and he was part of the group of younger white musicians who were learning from black musicians who came to Chicago from New Orleans and other places. And he absorbed as much as he could, and he was on all the great early recordings with Eddie Condon and Gene Krupa and Jimmy McPartland and Frank Teschmacher. And he had an incredible ferocity in his playing and a great delicacy. He was also a poet of the piano when he played beautiful songs. And after that first burst of recordings in the 20s, he did a lot of solo work, played with Bob Crosby's orchestra in the 1930s, had a great band of his own called the Cafe Society Orchestra, and ended up in San Francisco, where I met him many years later. I saw Joe Sullivan play the last time he played, and it was for my friend Richard Hadlock's kindergarten class. And Richard had asked him to come and play, and Joe probably didn't have much more than a year left to live at that point. And I drove him there, and I enjoyed every moment of it. And he said to the kindergarten kids, "I'm going to play. I've got it bad, and that ain't good." And immediately a kid raised his hand and said, "You're not supposed to say ain't." And Sullivan was sort of ready, and he said, "I know, but it's just the song title." And he played it. And I remember we got stuck in traffic that day when I drove him home, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Well, his most well-known song was Little Rock Getaway, and I'll try to do that now. And then I have something to say about Little Rock Getaway afterwards. This is Joe Sullivan's Little Rock Getaway. One day, Joe Sullivan came to my house to listen to music. Richard Hadlock was there. My longtime musical partner, Jim Goodwin, was there. And I had a tape running. And on the tape, there was a mixture of things, but I didn't realize that the Bob Crosby Orchestra recorded version of Little Rock Getaway was on there, and it came on. Sullivan was going to record that song with Bob Crosby, and he got tuberculosis and missed quite a bit of time. And Bob Zerke made the recording instead. And strangely enough, Zerke wrote sheet music out, and everybody I ever hear now who plays Little Rock Getaway plays it like Bob Zerke. So Sullivan heard this as it came on, and Jim Goodwin and I remembered this moment more than any. Sullivan stood up and yelled as loud as he possibly could, "That's not how you play it, Zerke." And, and I guess I like Bob Zerke, but I knew that if you're going to play Little Rock Getaway, you should try to get some of the spirit of Joe Sullivan. Well, here's something else. That's Rosetta from Earl Hines. Earl Hines was born in Duquesne, Pennsylvania, and grew up playing little jobs when he was very young in Pittsburgh. He said he learned his left hand from one guy and his right hand from another guy, and he gave him whiskey and chewing tobacco and beer to show him how to do the octaves and tenths. I always tend to think Hines was born fully formed from the head of Zeus, but he has his story. Very early he came to Chicago, and when he was in Chicago he met Louis Armstrong, and one of the big things is that they were both sort of startled about the other guy, how much they sounded like each other. And Armstrong and Hines and Zutty Singleton made a pact that they would always, throughout all their days, play together, and it never worked. But they did do some wonderful recordings in the 1920s. Hines' greatest recordings of that time were solos that he did for OK label and QRS, and also the recordings with Armstrong and the great Jimmy Noon Orchestra. And then about 1929, Hines settled in at the Grand Terrace, a big club that I think Al Capone ran in Chicago, and Hines played there for about 10 years. Hines' music is an endless parade of asymmetrical parts, things that don't look like they're going to work, and they all go together. Fast octaves, a run that seems to go downhill like it's going to go off a cliff, and then suddenly one note stops it. Whole tone scales, tritones, all these kinds of things that he mixed in, and often throwing things in the air and suspending the rhythm until just the last moment when he'd come back in and bring it all together. It was pretty dazzling. And his style changed through the years, but he always did this endless surprise, and it seemed to roll off him so easily. So Rosetta, I kind of break that down a little bit. Hines did tend to go single notes toward the center and then other notes toward the center from the other side. And he did play stride in the left hand too, but he mixed up a lot of things. That's a typical Hines fruit. That's a whole tone scale. Every other note in the scale, and it has a kind of a spooky quality. Hines wasn't alone in doing that. Bix Beiderbecke and Frankie Trumbauer and all kinds of other guys associated with them were experimenting with whole tone scales in the 1920s. But Hines, I'm ending this run kind of simulating that. And I hit an F sharp on a C chord. And it doesn't sound dissonant to me. Hines did that all the time. That's the flatted fifth, and the joke was in the 1940s, apparently from Eddie Condon, the bebop guys flat their fifths and we drink ours. But the truth is, those flatted fifths were always going on, and Hines loved to play dropping in the strangest sound for just a second or two when you least expect it. And then back. That note, it means a lot to me. If you play C at the same time as you play F sharp, that's the tritone. And it's supposed to sound so mysterious that it's been given names like the devil's chord and Satan's chord because it's ominous sounding. So ominous that it's the sound of European ambulance sirens. I always have felt that when you get to that point, you could say that you could play a C chord and an F sharp chord at the same time. It doesn't matter, they're the same chord. The flatted fifth of the C is F sharp. The flatted fifth of the F sharp is C. And it causes all sorts of wonderful surprise possibilities, the kind of things that make some of my traditional jazz friends turn their heads and wonder about me. If you're in E flat, that you can suddenly play an A chord because that's the flatted fifth. If you're on A flat, you could put a D in the bass. I love doing that. It sounds perfectly natural to me. Well, I met Earl Hines in Berkeley and Oakland. I lived in Berkeley and Oakland for many years, and so did, Hines lived in Oakland, and I followed him wherever he went, although he traveled mostly. And one night I was playing at a little club on Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley called the Bancroft Lounge, and Hines walked in. And I think he had been to some sort of seminar that day at Cal where he met the singer with me, Barbara Lashley, who was a wonderful singer. She sort of sounded like Maxine Sullivan, the great swing singer. And Hines came to see her, and he stayed to see me and her. And I thought when he came in, what do I do now? Well, I said that to myself, but as if he had heard me, he said, "You're drinking on Father Hines," which I really kind of liked. And he came in there, and also a place called the Serenader in Oakland. And I remember the Serenader had one little mezzanine table. It was like one little place you could go up on that spot like a crow's nest and sit there. And Hines sat there, and he was beaming. A lot of people think his smile was sort of commercial, but it might have been, but it was really his smile as he sat there, and he called out to Barbara, "Sing the pretty ones, sing the pretty ones." And he said he could get work for us. It never happened except New Year's Eve. And we played together at the Shattuck Hotel. I played first solo, and then Hines came on with a big band, sort of like Joe Sullivan. It was like a last hurrah. But there he was, and I was really happy to see Earl Hines. And he was very nice, very warm to me, and I always regretted that I didn't know how to play pinochle, because that's how he liked to spend his time, and I couldn't do it. I'm going to play Beaucoup Jack, which is something Hines recorded 2-3 times, and the one version I liked best was when he played a duet with Omer Simeon, a New Orleans clarinet player. Beaucoup Jack. Jess Stacy, he was one of the sweetest people who ever played jazz and a big influence on me, partly because of his lyrical playing. He had long melodic lines and he played these beautiful little fading tremolos, like a little vibrato. No one ever sounded more like a human voice on the piano than Jess Stacy. Jess came from a little town in southern Missouri and he grew up in Cape Girardeau and he played dance band things when he was in high school, traveling around with friends that he went to high school with. And later on he played calliope on one of the steamboats, and he told me he wore a big rubber raincoat because of the cinders that would be popping out of the smokestack on the steamboat. He had to protect himself. And like Hines, Stacy went to Chicago. He didn't make a big hit or anything when he first went there, and he played with Floyd Townes Orchestra for a while, and other people, the musicians, liked him, but Stacy never really became a big name until the mid-30s when he joined Benny Goodman's orchestra. And Goodman's orchestra, right at the moment when what we now call the swing era was getting its power, and he was the piano player in the most popular swing band. What that did was lead to more work for him as a soloist and with some of the Chicago guys like Bud Freeman. And he recorded a lot with Eddie Condon in the 40s. And I just love Jess Stacy's way of playing. He had long lines that he played. I'll play a little bit of a song he recorded called You're Driving Me Crazy. He played it at a slower tempo than the usual one. He played long lines and that little trailing vibrato, and he made use of all the notes on the chord, these lines that would go up and down, playing seconds and sixths and ninths and so on, chords that sometimes got passed by. And in that sense, his melodic playing was a lot like Bix Beiderbecke, whom he admired very much on both cornet and piano. And so he was sort of a mixture of those two different worlds. He had a nice little up and down sort of harmony on some things. His right hand would go uphill and his left hand would go up and then back down again. Kind of a neat sound. He played some fast runs, and he also had big hands. He's one of the few guys I know of where you can see this on film where he could play tenths really fast, up-tempo tenths, and just move them up and down like nobody could. And the runs he did in his right hand really came out of a simple procedure of playing just major triads, like a kind of simple process. I mean, it sounds fancy, but you just have to put your hands down in the right place. So Jess played a lot of neat little runs like that. So I'm going to play a song for him in a minute here. I met Jess Stacy in 1975 at the Sacramento Jazz Festival. And I was kind of shy about stuff like that, but I said, this guy means too much to me, and I just pushed my way up and said hello, and we became friends pretty fast. And he was going to play in a room that was crowded, and I said, I got to get this. And I just pushed my way up to the stage. When he was about to start, there was no room for anyone to sit. I kind of got up on the stage and slid partway under the piano. And the second he started playing, it really hit me, and I started crying. I looked across the room, and my friend Jim Goodwin was standing along the wall because there was no place left to sit, and he was crying too. Just had that effect, this depth of his character that came rolling through his piano playing. So when I met him, my favorite little story is that he was going to come hear me play in another room, and there was a band ahead of us, and their piano player didn't show up, and they asked me if I'd play. I said, no, I don't think I want to. And they asked him, and he said, I don't think I want to. And so we kind of stood there and watched that band, and it was just awful. It was kind of like all the worst dreams come true about bad Dixieland bands that are in bad taste and amateur ability at the same time. It sounded like 6 people with shotguns just setting them off randomly. And we watched, I remember, in silence, and then Jess turned to me with a southern accent and said, how would you like to be playing in that band right now? And I just broke up at that. It was so funny. We wrote to each other and called each other for many years, and one funny night, Jim Goodwin, and I believe it was Jim Goodwin, John Smith, and Dan Barrett, 3 friends. Dan Barrett's a wonderful trombone player. They all went out to Jess Stacy's house because they knew I knew him. And the way Jim described it, that it was pretty late, and he came to the door wearing pajamas, and he didn't know these 3 big guys at the door, and he let them in and gave them drinks and played records for them. Like out of nowhere, 3 guys he didn't know. And the next day he called me, and his exact words were, those nice boys came here last night. Those nice boys, those friend of yours, they were so nice. And I thought, what a guy, what a guy. So here's my little song called No Complaints, based on his song Complainin'. I asked him if I could use part of it, and he said yes. No complaints. I can say when I was at Jess's house, very happy to say we sat down at his piano and played, can't remember the song now, but we played a little bit of stuff. He said he played exercises on the piano. That's all he did, so to keep arthritis away. And well, he said, why don't I just play When Did You Leave Heaven instead? I like that guy. Here's something very different. That's kind of the blues according to Art Hodes. Art Hodes was an immigrant. I'm always happy to say that. One of the lucky immigrants. Coming to America, he came as an infant with his family from the Ukraine. They settled in Chicago. And when he was old enough, Art took piano lessons at Jane Addams' Hull House on South Halsted Street. I won't go too far into that, but Jane Addams is one of my favorite American heroes for her depth of character and kindness to people who needed help. So Art Hodes took lessons there at the same time that Benny Goodman took clarinet lessons there. Art Hodes also was learning from the black blues players in clubs in Chicago, and he became committed to blues playing no matter what he did. And if I slow it down to figure out what it is he does, I tend to not be able to do it anymore, but he does a lot of smears with the left hand. And a lot of this with the right hand. So it becomes like this. And he liked to spread his harmony out so that the parts of the harmony would be at different ends of the piano. And he had a way of bending in and out of a note. That started on a G, goes up to an A flat, and goes back to a G, and just kind of the way you wobble your finger on it. And he also played music that would all sound like blues no matter what he was playing. And that was in an era when you could take pop songs from daily life and play them. So in I think it was 1938, there was a movie called Hurricane. A Pacific Island film with John Hall and Dorothy Lamour, and one of the songs in that film was "The Moon of Manakura," which was a Hawaiian waltz, and Hodes just played it like a blues. And I saw that years ago in a discography that Hodes had done that, and it was rejected. But I always wondered what would it have sounded like if I had heard it. So I always tried to play it. Recent years it's been issued. It sounded like kind of what I thought. Here's a little of Moon of Manakura, just to see Art Hodes playing on something that's not a blues. Art Hodes didn't record very much during his first long stint in Chicago. It wasn't until he moved to New York that he started meeting more people and recording with them. He was also a communicator for jazz. He had a radio program in New York, and he also edited a magazine called Jazz Record, where people would write about their lives or other musicians' lives. It was kind of an early attempt to tell a jazz story. So he was pretty concerned with communicating that to people. I was really crazy about Art Hodes when I first started playing, and it was a message I could figure out. I never understood why no one else seemed to want to play like Art Hodes. And my piano teacher, Johnny Whitwer, knew that, and he had a 21st birthday party for me. And he had written to Art Hodes and said, could you send a birthday greeting to Ray for his 21st birthday? And Hodes did. And I was really thrilled by that. And then years later, I met him in California many times with things he was doing out there. The most notable thing, perhaps, was that those magazines that he issued as Jazz Record got collected by the University of California Press and published as a book called Selections from the Gutter, I guess, real life. And that was really wonderful that they did that. And at the time that that happened, Richard Hadlock and I had a radio program on KQED in San Francisco, and they wanted to publicize it. So they had Art Hodes come out to my house, and he sat at the piano and talked about music and played. What an idea. And Richard Hadlock and I sat there and asked him a few questions, and I remember him saying how Al Capone and his friends put a glass of whiskey out there for him. He was really young playing, and he didn't get to it. Then they put another one, and then they put another, you know, and they were all laughing because they knew he had to drink them all or else they'd get angry with him. But I loved doing that little show, and it was really fun to hear him talking about music. He was really interested in communicating, and he was a wonderful blues player. He and I, in fact, at one of the little parties out there, we played a few blues together, and he was sort of a big hero to me. I know in many ways people think of him, he was the first white person to really play convincing blues on the piano, and lived a long life and kept doing it the whole time. Here's his song, A Selection from the Gutter, after which the book was named. It's just a simple blues, so it's going to be me too. Everything is. How can I help it? Before I could do very much of anything else, I could always play like that. And I was about 20 years old. I don't know how that happened. I didn't start playing piano until I was 19. And I keep trying to absorb all these guys that I've been listening to, and I'm not sure that there's a Chicago style. It's just a kind of a Chicago attitude in a whole lot of people who set out to be the truest versions of themselves, which meant inventing the world when they played and having certain techniques in common. I like other Chicago piano players. I don't have as much to say about them, but the great Cass Simpson, who was like Earl Hines gone out of his mind, one of the greatest piano players who ever lived. He spent most of his life at the Elgin, Illinois Mental Institution, where he did his greatest recordings. And Jimmy Yancey, he was the first piano player I ever tried to play like. Before I knew anything about piano, I used to sneak into buildings. I remember going into the University District, University of Washington District, YWCA, and they had a piano in there, and no one seemed to bother me, and I'd go in and play what I thought was like Jimmy Yancey. And the great Zinke Cohn, who's kind of nearly completely unknown, but a great piano player who took Earl Hines' place in the Jimmy Noon Band, was another one. And then there are other piano players who sounded like Chicago people. They really weren't. Horace Henderson and Mary Lou Williams. And then piano players who represent other kinds of things in me, like the chords and the funny chords like Thelonious Monk and Duke Ellington and Charles Ives and Bix Beiderbecke. All that runs through me too. And the open space that I love from Count Basie and Sir Charles Thompson. And I also love other horn players. I love to play songs that are not piano songs, just songs that bands play. That was a big lesson of me from listening to all of these piano players that played songs that bands played. And it made a whole new world of material, play what a band would do that no other piano player ever did. And I like to think of myself as being influenced by Louis Armstrong or Red Allen on trumpet or Frank Teschmacher or Jimmy Noon on clarinet. Well, here's a little band song that maybe mushes a lot of that together. Joe Sullivan was on a recording of this in the 1920s with the group called the Chicago Rhythm Kings. I Found a New Baby. Well, that's sort of, I found a new baby. And it's the kind of music that takes you to the edge of the cliff and tries to push you off, which is how I like to play, for better or for worse. But it's better for my soul to do that than anything else. And I hope that mixed a lot of different people in there. Probably as I play something like that, I realize maybe Joe Sullivan is the biggest force in doing that. But he did that. Playing the piano is a little bit like, I have a very tiny poem called The Piano. It's it's everything, nothing, the keys, I reach my hands into soft soil. And I guess if I'm feeling really at home about playing the piano, which I sometimes do, that's what I hope that it becomes, is reaching my hands into that soft soil. Is there a Chicago style of piano? Yes, there is. And it's all based on independence of spirit. It does include octaves and tenths and blues and variations on the tenths and suspended rhythm and contrary motion and all those things that I hope I tried to put into this. And yet there's no single answer to that, which is probably what the answer is. No template that you could just do. You have to be there and be immersed so that that's how you want to spend your life. I'd like to play another song, maybe to end. This is My Little Pride and Joy. This is a song that Joe Sullivan wrote for his son. And it's the kind of thing that I like to do, that Joe Sullivan liked to do when he said, when people aren't asking him to beat his brains out. And it's the poetic approach to piano playing and a quietness that I like to see. My Little Pride and Joy.